40. That was how old Sarah was when everything she had built disappeared in a single month. The house, the marriage, the career she had spent 15 years constructing brick by careful brick. Gone. Not gradually, not with warning signs she could have read earlier, just gone. The way a window breaks, one moment whole, the next in pieces on the floor. She was 41 by the time she understood what had happened to her, and 41 and a half, sitting on the bare floor of an empty living room with a foreclosure notice in her hand and no plan for what came next when she made the decision that changed everything. It wasn't a big decision. It wasn't dramatic. It took exactly 5 minutes, and it started before the sun came up. This is Sarah's story, and if you've ever felt like you left it too late, this story is for you. Sarah had done everything right. That was the part that made it so hard to understand. She had followed every instruction the world gives to people who want to be safe. She studied hard, got the degree, marketing first class, landed the job at a mid-sized agency in the city at 24, worked her way up steadily, carefully, with the kind of discipline that earns respect without ever demanding it. By 32, she was running her own department. By 36, she was a director. She married at 30, a man named James, who was kind and funny and ambitious in the same careful way she was. They bought a 3-bedroom house in a suburb they'd researched thoroughly. They planted a garden in the first spring. They talked about children. Life felt for a long time exactly like the version of itself they had planned. But somewhere in the years between 30 and 40, something quieter had been happening. Not a crisis, nothing dramatic, just a slow, almost imperceptible drift. James had changed, or she had changed, or they had changed into people who wanted different things and had been too busy being competent to notice. The conversations that used to last until midnight had been replaced by parallel scrolling in silence. The garden they'd planted together was something only she maintained. At work, the agency was restructuring. The industry was shifting. The skills she'd built over 15 years were being automated, condensed, outsourced. She knew this. She'd been managing around it for 2 years, quietly, without telling anyone how precarious things felt. And then, in the space of 28 days, 1 month, the shortest month of all that particular year, 4 things happened in sequence. The restructure took her role, not loudly, just eliminated. A polite email from HR, a box of her things collected by Friday. James told her on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen that he didn't think they wanted the same things anymore. He was calm about it, considered, as if he had been preparing the sentence for weeks. The mortgage payment she had been covering alone since James had reduced his hours went unpaid, then a second time. And on the first Saturday of March, sitting in a house that was no longer hers, and a marriage that was no longer real, and a career that had quietly ceased to exist, Sarah opened an envelope she had been avoiding for 10 days. Foreclosure notice. She sat down on the floor, not on the sofa, on the floor. And for the first time in 41 years of doing everything right, Sarah had absolutely no idea what to do next. She sat there for a long time. And then, because she was Sarah, and Sarah was the kind of person who had always found a way, she picked up the envelope, folded it carefully, and placed it on the windowsill. She was not done. She just didn't know that yet. Now, I want to pause here, because what happens next in Sarah's story is not what you expect. She didn't find a mentor. She didn't get a lucky break. She didn't find the strength from somewhere deep inside herself in a single dramatic moment. What she did was much smaller than any of that. She woke up at 5:12 in the morning, 6 days after sitting on that floor, and she made one decision. In 5 minutes. Before she let the world tell her who she was now. The 6 days after sitting on the floor were the hardest of Sarah's life. Not because of the practical problems, though those were real and pressing and relentless. The calls to make, the solicitors, the accounts to separate, the friends to tell, the parents to call, the humiliation, worn quietly, of being a person who had managed everything successfully for 20 years and now managing nothing. No, the hardest part was something else entirely. It was the story. The story she kept telling herself at 3 o'clock in the morning when the flat she was renting, the single room, temporary, 2 streets from the house she had lost, was so quiet she could hear her own breathing. The story went like this. You are 41 years old. You have no home, no marriage, no job. You spent 15 years building something, and it is gone. You did everything right, and it made no difference. Who exactly do you think you are now? She knew the story wasn't entirely true. But at 3 a.m., alone with the foreclosure notice still sitting on the windowsill because she hadn't been able to make herself throw it away, the story felt more real than anything else. On the 6th night, she didn't sleep at all. She lay in the dark going over the numbers, the savings that remained, enough for 4 months if she was careful. The freelance work she'd been offered twice and declined because she'd always had a salary to fall back on. The calls she needed to make that she'd been putting off because making them meant admitting things were as serious as they were. At 4:47 in the morning, she gave up on sleep. She got up, made tea, stood at the small window of her rented room and watched the city do the thing it does before dawn, the way it goes from completely dark to just slightly less dark. So gradually you can never pinpoint the exact moment it began to change. And something in that, the almost invisible shift from dark to less dark, made her think about a conversation she'd had years ago. A woman she'd interviewed for a profile piece early in her career. A woman in her late 60s who had lost everything at 52. Business, husband, home, the full picture, and rebuilt from nothing. Sarah had asked her during the interview what the turning point was, and the woman had said something that Sarah had written down at the time but not understood. She said, "The turning point was the morning I stopped asking what happened to me and started asking who I was going to be because of it." Sarah had filed that sentence in the part of her mind reserved for other people's wisdom, things that didn't apply to her yet because her own life was still intact. It was 5:09 in the morning. The city outside was doing its slow, imperceptible shift toward dawn. Sarah picked up the only notebook she'd brought from the house, a plain black one half filled with work notes that were now irrelevant, and turned to the first blank page, and she wrote 5 words at the top. Who am I choosing now? Not who was I, not who should I have been, not what went wrong. Who am I choosing to be, right now, this morning, with what I have left, from this exact moment forward? She sat with the question for 5 minutes, and then she answered it. What Sarah wrote in those 5 minutes was not a business plan. It was not a list of goals. It was not a recovery strategy. It was a single paragraph, 8 sentences, and it was the most honest thing she had ever written. Because for the first time in 41 years of performing competence for the world, she wrote the truth about who she actually was, not who she had been pretending to be, who she was. Here is what Sarah wrote, not a plan, not an affirmation, not a list of what she would do, a declaration of identity. She started with the question at the top of the page, who am I choosing now? And then she wrote, I am someone who has lost things before and rebuilt. I am someone who does not need the life I planned in order to build the life I want. I am someone who is afraid right now and moving forward anyway. I am someone whose value was never the job title, or the house, or the marriage, and I know that even though I forgot it somewhere along the way. I am someone who is 41 years old, with everything I know and everything I've survived, and that is not a liability. That is a foundation. She read it back. Then she wrote one more sentence. I am not starting over. I am starting from experience. 8 sentences, 5 minutes, 5:17 in the morning. Now I want to explain why this specific practice, this 5-minute identity declaration at dawn, did something that no business plan or recovery strategy could have. Because most people, when they lose something significant, begin the process of rebuilding from the wrong starting point. They start from the loss. They define themselves by what is missing, by the gap between where they are and where they were, by the difference between the life they had and the life they're now living. And that starting point, that deficit identity, shapes every decision they make in the months that follow. It makes them smaller than they are. It makes the obstacles larger than they are. It makes the future feel like compensation rather than possibility. Sarah's 5 minutes did something different. She didn't deny the loss. She didn't pretend the foreclosure notice wasn't real, or that the marriage ending hadn't devastated her, or that the career disappearing wasn't genuinely frightening. She did something more precise than denial. She separated her identity from her circumstances. She said, "This is what happened to my life. This is not what happened to me." And that separation, that deliberate, written 5-minute separation, changed the lens through which every subsequent decision was made. Psychologists call this narrative identity. The story we tell about ourselves doesn't just reflect how we see the world, it actively shapes the decisions we make, the risks we take, and the speed at which we recover from setbacks. People who frame loss as something that happened to them tend to recover faster and more completely than people who frame loss as something that defines them. Sarah didn't know the science. She just knew that when she put the notebook down at 5:17 and looked out the window at a city that was now unmistakably gold rather than gray, she felt, for the first time in 6 days, like herself. Not the version of herself that had existed before the loss. A clearer version. One that knew things the previous version had been too comfortable to learn. She made her tea, she sat at the small table, and for the first time in the worst month of her life, she opened her laptop not to check what had gone wrong, but to begin something new. The 5 minutes were over. The comeback had started. The first thing Sarah did that morning was reply to one of the freelance offers she had declined. Just one. Not the best one, not the most prestigious, the one she could start immediately. She wrote a 3-paragraph email, professional, direct, no mention of the circumstances that had led her to be available. Then she closed the laptop and got dressed. The email she sent that morning became a 3-month contract. The contract led to an introduction. The introduction led to a conversation with a small business owner who needed exactly what Sarah knew how to do. None of this happened quickly. None of it was without difficulty. Week 2, she lost the first contract when the client's budget was cut. She sat with that for half a day. Then she opened her notebook to the page with the 8 sentences, read it, closed it, opened the laptop again. Week 3, she had a conversation with her solicitor about the final stages of the mortgage proceedings that left her sitting in a coffee shop for 40 minutes, unable to think clearly. A stranger at the next table asked if she was all right. She said yes. She wasn't. She wrote in the notebook anyway that evening. I am not starting over. I am starting from experience. Month 2 brought the first sign that the foundation was holding. A former colleague reached out about a consultancy project. The budget was larger than anything Sarah had managed as a freelancer. She was terrified. She pitched for it anyway. She got it. Not because she had recovered, she hadn't, not fully, not yet, but because the woman who sat in that pitch meeting was not leading with her loss, she was leading with 20 years of knowledge, hard-won and precisely relevant, and the particular clarity that comes from a person who has had everything stripped back and found they were still standing. She got the contract. Month 3, 2 more clients. Month 4, she moved out of the rented room into a flat of her own, small, entirely hers. Month 6, she was earning more than she had as a director. Not because the industry had changed, because she had stopped waiting for the structure to carry her and started building the structure herself. 1 year after sitting on the floor of an empty house with a foreclosure notice in her hand, Sarah was sitting at a desk in her own flat at 5:14 in the morning. The same time, the same notebook, the same question at the top of every new page. Who am I choosing now? The answers had changed as the months had passed. They were less about survival and more about direction, less about proving something and more about building something. But the question was still there, every morning, before the world arrived. I want to talk directly to someone watching this. Someone who isn't 41, maybe older, maybe younger, but feeling older. Someone who is sitting with the quiet, persistent fear that the moment for them has already passed, that too much has gone wrong, that the gap between where they are and where they wanted to be is now too wide to cross. I want to say this as clearly as I can. Sarah did not beat the clock. She stopped listening to it. And the 5 minutes she used to do that, at 5 o'clock in the morning, before the world came for her, cost nothing. Nothing except the willingness to answer one honest question. Sarah lost everything at 40. By 42, she had more than she'd had before, not in the same form, not in the same shape, but more in the ways that actually matter. More clarity about what she was building and why. More ownership over the decisions that shaped her days. More evidence that she was someone who could survive the unsurvivable and keep moving forward. None of that came from a recovery plan. It came from 5 minutes. Before the world woke up, before the fear got loud again, before the circumstances of her life were able to convince her one more time that they were the truth about who she was. Here is what I want you to take from Sarah's story. There is a question that most people never ask themselves, not because they don't have the answer, but because the answer requires honesty that feels dangerous. The question is this: who am I choosing to be right now with what I have from this exact moment forward? Not who were you before the loss, not who should you have been, not who will you be when things get better. Who are you choosing to be now? You may have noticed something across the 3 stories we've told on this channel. Marcus, Daniel, Sarah. Different losses, different ages, different circumstances, but every single one of them found their way back to themselves in the same window of time. Before 5 o'clock. In the morning, before the world arrived, before the noise. That is not a coincidence, and it is not finished. So here is your challenge, and it is 5 minutes. Tomorrow morning, before you check your phone, before you open your inbox, before anyone tells you who you are today, open a notebook to a blank page. Right at the top, who am I choosing now? And answer it honestly. Not perfectly, not completely. Honestly. 8 sentences if you can. 1 sentence if that's all you have. But write it, by hand, in your own voice, before the world has the chance to answer that question for you. If you're starting tomorrow, drop fresh page in the comments. That's all, fresh page, a new chapter beginning. Because Marcus found his way back to himself at 5 a.m. after years of waking up miserable. Daniel found his after 7 failures. Sarah found hers at 41 on the floor with nothing left to lose. And all 3 of them share one thing. They found it before sunrise. Now, there's a 4th story, and this one is different. It doesn't come from a notebook or a morning routine or a personal crisis. It comes from something much older than any of that. Something a poor man discovered centuries ago. A secret so simple that generations of the world's most successful people have used it without ever naming it. Until now. The next story is already waiting for you. I'll see you before sunrise.